My parents took me to dinner for my birthday. "We are giving your inheritance to Chloe," Dad said. "She has kids, and you are alone." I sipped my water and asked, "Does Grandma know you stole it?" The color drained from his face when I said, "The account number," not metaphorically, not as some vague threat. I said the actual number, 17 digits, the routing prefix, the last four. The number Grandma had pressed into my hand in a folded piece of paper 6 months before she died, in a kitchen that smelled like Earl Grey and old wood, while her hands shook just slightly around a mug of tea she was never going to drink. He knew what it meant the second I said it, and I knew he knew, because the man who had spent 40 years perfecting the art of appearing unbothered went pale so fast it looked like someone pulled a plug. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To explain why that number destroyed him, I have to go back to the beginning. Not the beginning of the dinner, the beginning of all of it. The beginning of the part of my family's story they were counting on me being too polite to tell. My grandmother's name was Eleanor, and she was the kind of woman who made other women nervous. Not because she was cruel, she wasn't. She was, by almost any measure, generous to a fault. She taught piano lessons for 40 years, at rates she hadn't raised since 1974, because she didn't want to price out the kids whose parents were scraping. She kept a drawer in her kitchen full of nothing but takeout menus from restaurants she'd never been to, in case someone came over and was hungry and she didn't have what they wanted. She once spent 3 weeks organizing a fundraiser for a family down the street who'd lost everything in a kitchen fire, people she'd barely spoken to before. She was kind. She was genuinely, structurally kind, in the way that comes from decades of practice rather than temperament, but she was also completely ruthlessly perceptive. She saw things. Not in a mystical sense, Rain. She wasn't the type to make pronouncements or offer cryptic warnings. She just paid attention when other people stopped. She watched. She remembered. And she had an uncanny ability to know, sometimes years in advance, when a situation was going to go wrong and exactly how. This made some people uncomfortable. It made my father deeply uncomfortable. He'd always had a slightly unnatural relationship with being observed. He liked being seen when he chose to be seen, at the head of the table, pouring the wine, making the toast, playing the patriarch. What he didn't like was being watched. There's a difference, and Eleanor understood the difference perfectly. She and my father had a complicated relationship, which is a generous way of saying they had never actually liked each other, and everyone had agreed somewhere along the line to pretend otherwise. My father, whose name is Richard, is the kind of man who is very charming until the moment you need something from him, and then becomes inexplicably busy. He is not a monster. I want to be fair to him. He wasn't violent, wasn't cruel in any obvious way, wasn't the kind of father whose behavior you could point to and say, "There, that's the thing, that's what broke us." He was more the slow erosion type, the kind of damage that accumulates through years of small disappointments, of being talked over, of having your accomplishments acknowledged briefly before the conversation pivoted back to him, of always feeling like you were slightly outside the radius of his attention, orbiting something that would never quite let you land. He married my mother when they were both 25. My mother, whose name is Patricia, is a woman who reorganized her entire personality around my father sometime in her early 30s, and has been running that version of herself ever since. She was smart, funny, independent before him. I've seen pictures. There's a photograph from her college years where she's standing on top of a mountain she climbed, laughing so hard her eyes are closed, sunburned, muddy, genuinely unguarded. I've looked at that photograph many times over the years and thought, I don't know this person. The woman I grew up with was careful, measured, always watching my father's face before she finished a sentence, calibrating, adjusting. She stopped mountain climbing when they got married. She stopped a lot of things. They had 2 children. My sister Chloe, who arrived 3 years before me and was immediately understood by everyone to be the point of the operation, and me. Chloe was the child my parents had wanted. She was social, performative, beautiful in the way that makes adults coo. The kind of kid who would put on impromptu shows in the living room and accept applause with the unself-conscious confidence of someone who had never once wondered whether they deserved it. My parents adored her. My father in particular found her delightful in a way he found almost nothing else. She was an audience that never got bored, a mirror that only reflected him well. I was the child they also had. I don't say this with bitterness anymore. I've done enough years of therapy to understand that it wasn't malice, just a mismatch of temperament they never tried very hard to bridge. I was quiet. I read too much and talked too little. I was interested in things they didn't understand and uninterested in the performance of family that they'd built their identity around. My father's interest in me was intermittent. Like a radio station you can only get clearly in certain weather. When it was good, it was genuinely warm. He'd come into my room and ask what I was reading and actually listen when I told him. But those moments were unpredictable, and in between them was a long, static nothing. Eleanor was my people from almost the beginning. She lived 20 minutes from us, in the house she'd owned since before my father was born. A Victorian with a wraparound porch and a garden that looked chaotic but was actually extremely organized once you knew what you were looking at. She had strong opinions about soil drainage. She made her own jam. She had a cat named Bernard who was enormous and profoundly antisocial and who, for reasons I've never fully understood, adored me. I started spending Saturdays at her house when I was 6. Initially because my parents needed childcare and Chloe didn't want to go and I didn't have strong feelings about it. And then very quickly because I wanted to. Because her house was quiet in a way that felt like breathing rather than held breath. Because she talked to me like I had thoughts worth listening to. Because she had a study full of books organized by subject and then alphabetically within subject. And she let me reorganize one shelf by color one afternoon just to see what it looked like. And then we argued amiably about whether it was better or worse for 20 minutes. She taught me to play poker when I was 8. Not well. She was always a significantly better player than than me, but she taught me the fundamentals with the same seriousness she'd have applied to teaching an adult. She said the most useful thing about poker wasn't the winning. It was learning to read what people were trying not to show you. I thought about that a lot at the birthday dinner. I thought about how my father, who had always considered himself the better card player in the family, had in fact never once beaten his own mother, and how she'd let him believe for years that it was luck. The health decline started slowly, as these things tend to do. Eleanor was in her late 70s when I first noticed it. Not anything dramatic, just a slight increase in the time it took her to rise from a chair, a name that went temporarily missing, a momentary confusion about whether she'd already told me this particular story. Small things. The kind of things that are easy to dismiss and that the person experiencing them will often dismiss themselves because the alternative is acknowledging what they mean. She was diagnosed with a slow-moving lymphoma at 79. The oncologist said slow-moving with the professional reassurance of someone who says it frequently, which is to say in a tone calibrated to be reassuring without being a promise. He explained the treatment options. He explained what success would look like and what the absence of success would look like. He used language that was precise and kind and completely terrifying once you translated it out of medical. She called me that evening, not my father, not Chloe, me. "I'm sick," she said, in a tone that was more matter-of-fact than anything else. The doctor used a lot of words. I've written them down. "Can you come on Tuesday and help me understand them?" I came on Tuesday. I helped her understand them. Then I came the following Tuesday, and the one after that. It became the shape of things. Tuesdays were ours, not in any dramatic, declared way. It wasn't as if we sat down and made an arrangement. It was just that I started showing up and she started expecting me. And then the expectation became the structure, and the structure became the scaffolding of those 2 years. The drive was 40 minutes door to door, highway for the first 20, then a series of county roads that went through farmland and a small town with a diner I liked and a hardware store that somehow still existed. I made that drive so many times I stopped having to think about it. My hands knew the turns. There's something about a route you've driven enough. It stops being driving and starts being more like a form of moving meditation. 40 minutes of the same view, the same turns, the same radio stations with the same hosts arguing about the same things, and your mind goes somewhere else. Sometimes I would think about work. Sometimes I would think about nothing. Sometimes I would think about Eleanor in her kitchen with her tea and her cat and her organized shelves, and I would feel very acutely how much I would miss it all when it was over. I never told her that. It seemed cruel to make her responsible for my anticipatory grief. She always had the passenger seat adjusted when I arrived. She'd moved it forward 3 inches because I'm taller than she'd ever been, and she'd do it before I got there so I wouldn't have to fiddle with it in the driveway while she stood at the window watching. This is the kind of consideration that costs almost nothing and means almost everything. My father had been driving me to school in the same car for 3 years before he learned the seat needed to be moved. The chemo was every 3rd Tuesday. The other Tuesdays, we ran errands or did nothing or watched old films she'd recorded on a VCR she still used and refused to replace because it worked fine. She had an elaborate personal theory about the planned obsolescence of consumer electronics that she'd been developing since approximately 1995, and I had heard most of it more than once and didn't mind. During the chemo, I'd sit with her in the infusion center for 3.5 hours. These were long hours. Not unpleasant exactly, but with a particular quality of compression. Time moves differently in medical settings, heavier somehow. Like the air itself has more specific gravity. She'd nap sometimes. Sometimes we'd talk. Sometimes she'd just hold my hand and we'd watch the IV drip and not say anything. And I'd learned by then that she wasn't the type to need the silence filled, and I wasn't either. My father came twice in 8 months. The first time was a Sunday in February, and he brought flowers that were too expensive and slightly the wrong kind. She preferred wildflowers, had said so often, and sat with her for 40 minutes before getting a phone call he said he needed to take. The second time was in April, and he stayed longer, but he spent most of it walking around the house with a slightly appraising expression I recognized. Hands in his pockets, eyes moving over the furniture, the fixtures, the walls. Occasionally opening a drawer and closing it again, not looking through things, he wasn't that obvious, but cataloging. He'd brought a real estate brochure that second time for a new development in a retirement community 40 miles away. He laid it on the kitchen table between them like a peace offering and started talking about how it might be worth considering, given the maintenance requirements of a house this size, given her condition. Eleanor picked up the brochure, read the front, turned it over, read the back, then she folded it in half and then in quarters and put it in the kitchen trash. She did this while my father was still mid-sentence. Then she refilled his coffee and asked if he wanted anything else before he headed home. She told me about it the following Tuesday in a tone that was completely neutral, purely descriptive, like she was reading a weather report. He brought a brochure, she said. "Have you seen these retirement communities? They have shuffleboard." I know her well enough to know that shuffleboard was not a point in anyone's favor. She gave me the paper on a Tuesday in October. We were in the car, just pulled into her driveway after chemo, and she reached into the pocket of the cardigan she always wore to the infusion center and produced a folded note. She held it out without preamble. "This is an account number," she said. "A routing number and an account number. Don't write them anywhere obvious. Keep them somewhere boring." I took the paper. I looked at her. "Is this—" I started. "Don't ask," she said. "Not because I won't tell you. Because the less explaining I do, the simpler it is. Just know that your name is on it and yours alone, and it has been for 3 years." She was looking straight ahead, through the windshield at her own front porch. Bernard the cat was sitting in the window. She was quiet for a moment. "Don't let your father near this. He'll smile and spend every penny, and then he'll feel terrible about it. Genuinely terrible, which won't help you one bit. And when he feels terrible, he'll find a reason why it wasn't his fault. He's been doing that his entire life. She turned and looked at me then, and there was something in her expression that was both very tired and very resolved. I see more than they think I see, she said. I always have. Promise me you won't be polite about this when the time comes. I promise, I said. She patted my knee once, the way she had since I was 6, and got out of the car. I sat in the driveway for a moment after she went inside. I took out my phone and opened my notes app. I created a new note. I titled it Grocery List, which is a boring enough label that no one would open it. I typed in the numbers. Then I went inside and had tea and argued with her about whether the third Beethoven piano concerto is underrated or correctly rated, and went home. I thought about what she'd said for weeks afterward, the plainness of it. No drama, no big speech, no elaborate set of instructions, just a piece of paper and a clear directive delivered with the same tone she used for everything else that mattered to her. Quiet, direct, completely certain. That was the thing about Eleanor. She was never theatrical about the things she was serious about. The theatrics were saved for things that weren't important. She could be very dramatic about a bad film, about a sluggish city council, about Bernard's dietary requirements, but when something actually mattered, she got still. I started to understand, in those weeks, what she was protecting me from. I started to notice things I'd been choosing not to notice. My father's relationship with money has always been complicated in a way that is both entirely explicable and somehow hard to fully describe. He has never been poor, and he has never been the kind of rich that removes money as an anxiety. He's been in that particular middle zone where there's always enough and never quite enough, and the gap between those two things is constantly in motion. He grew up comfortable but not wealthy. He earned well in his 30s and 40s. He also made decisions that undid most of what he earned. A restaurant investment with a college friend that folded in 11 months, a rental property bought at the wrong time in the wrong neighborhood, a series of stock decisions made on tips from other men at a golf club who probably didn't know more than he did, but talked with sufficient confidence that it amounted to the same thing. Each failure was explained afterward as bad luck, unforeseeable circumstances, an unfair market. He never had a failure that was his fault. The record of self-exculpation was, at this point, practically geological in its accumulation. My mother knew all of this and had reorganized her anxiety around it in the same way she'd reorganized everything else, quietly, without complaint, finding a way to be fine with things that were not actually fine. She'd gone back to work as an administrative coordinator when I was in middle school, and the income she brought in had, for most of my adult life, been the more stable half of the household. My father knew this and didn't like knowing it. It showed in small ways, small, corrosive ways. After Eleanor got sick, I started to see him differently. Not with new information exactly. I'd known all of this, but with new clarity. The way his attention sharpened around conversations about her estate. The way he started CCing himself on emails from her doctor as her son. He had authority, and he used it, not to take care of her, but to stay informed about the kind of information that matters for asset planning. The way he would make comments about the house at family dinners, angled carefully to sound practical and concerned, but underneath was a different kind of attention entirely. He'd been waiting a long time for Eleanor to die. Not cruelly, but in the manner of someone who has banked on an inheritance the way other people bank on a raise, quietly assuming it is coming, organizing their life around the assumption, and becoming deeply invested in the timing. I thought about all of this sitting in my car after she gave me that piece of paper, and I made a decision then that I didn't fully articulate even to myself. I would wait. I would say nothing. I would let whatever was going to happen happen, and I would keep my grocery list note in my phone and trust her. She had been reading cards for 60 years. She knew what hands to play and when. Eleanor died on a Thursday in March, 7 months after she pressed the paper into my hand. She died in the morning in the hospice room, which had a window that faced east so it got the early light. I had been there the night before and stayed until about midnight, at which point one of the nurses gently suggested I go home and sleep and come back in the morning. I didn't make it back in time. She went around 6 a.m. I found out by phone from the hospice nurse, a woman named Deirdre, who had the uncommon grace to be both gentle and direct in the same breath. She was calm, she said. She was not in pain. It was, in the language of these things, a good death. I sat on my kitchen floor for about an hour, not crying exactly. It wasn't that organized, more the physical sensation of something leaving, the way a room feels different after someone walks out of it, a shift in pressure, in air. Then I called into work and went back to her house and sat with Bernard for a while, who had seemingly understood that something was wrong and was moving through the rooms with a different quality than usual, checking corners, sitting for a moment, and then moving on. I fed him. I made tea in her kitchen with the yellow curtains. I sat at her table and did not try to figure out how I felt because I was not sure I could yet. My father arrived around noon with a folder. He said the right things. He was sorry. She had a good life. These things are never easy. He held my mother while she cried, which was genuine. My mother loved Eleanor even if she didn't always understand her, and the grief was real. Chloe came later with her husband and children, and the children ran through the house the way children do without knowing what it means to be quiet in a place someone has just left, and it was fine. It was exactly what it was. But my father had a folder. He put it on the kitchen table after a while and started to explain what it contained. Documents about the estate, documents about probate. He was the executor, he explained. Eleanor had named him as executor of the main will. As her only child, it was only natural, and he was taking that responsibility very seriously and would keep everyone fully informed at every step. He used the phrase "at every step" several times. It had the quality of a phrase someone practices. I asked him if I could have a copy of the will. He said he'd have his solicitor prepare something once things were a little further along, once the estate was properly assessed, once the probate timeline was clearer. He said this with a kind of procedural authority, the language of someone who who has done research and wants you to know it. He said these things take time and it was important not to rush them, and he would make sure everything was handled properly and fairly. I said okay. I didn't push. I drove home that night and opened my notes app and looked at the grocery list. For the 2 months after Eleanor died, nothing particularly alarming happened on the surface. My father sent occasional brief updates by email. Probate is progressing, assessments underway. These things take time. My mother called every couple of weeks and talked about how hard it was, how much she missed her, how the house was going to be difficult to manage, and they were looking into options. Chloe texted occasionally to ask if there was any news about the estate, which was not subtle, but was, at least, direct. I went to work. I ran my errands. I stopped at Eleanor's house a few times, just to check that it was being maintained, that Bernard, who had been adopted by a neighbor Eleanor had designated for exactly this purpose, was getting his specific and demanding dietary requirements met. He was. The neighbor, a woman in her 60s named Constance, who had known Eleanor for 30 years and been given very thorough written instructions, seemed to be managing him with the appropriate mixture of firmness and deference that he required. At no point did I call the lawyer whose name was on the card Eleanor had slipped into my pocket at Christmas. I had the card. I looked at it occasionally. I left it alone. It was around the 6-week mark that I started to see things that didn't add up. Nothing dramatic. More the financial equivalent of realizing a piece of furniture has been moved. Nothing is explicitly wrong, but something is different and you didn't move it and you know you didn't move it. My cousin mentioned offhand at a family gathering about 8 weeks after Eleanor died that she'd heard the estate was being finalized quickly, faster than usual. She'd heard it was going to avoid probate altogether, or at least most of it. She said my uncle had said something about my father having handled the setup well in advance. She said this with the admiring tone of someone who finds competent family administration impressive. I thought about the folder on the kitchen table on the day Eleanor died. 2 days later, I called the lawyer. His name was Arthur Connolly, and he'd been Eleanor's attorney for 19 years. She'd found him through a friend, she'd told me once. He'd helped the friend navigate a complicated estate dispute with a discretion and competence that she found impressive. She'd hired him for her own estate planning and kept him ever since. He answered on the second ring. His voice was dry and measured, with a particular quality of patience that speaks to decades of delivering information to people who are not ready to receive it. I'd been wondering when you'd call, he said. Your grandmother told me you were the careful type. She said you'd wait until you were sure something was happening before you did anything about it. Something is happening, I said. I don't know exactly what. He told me to come to his office. He gave me an address. Downtown, older building, the kind of place with heavy doors and serious wood paneling and no reception area, just a buzzer. I went the next morning. He had the documents already laid out on his desk. She came to me 3 years ago, he said, when she first started suspecting that her son had developed an active plan for the estate, rather than merely a passive interest in it. There's a difference, and she recognized it. He explained the account. He explained how it had been structured. A separate legal entity, a revocable living trust that became irrevocable on Eleanor's death, funded over 3 years through a series of transfers that were individually unremarkable. $182,000 in total. My name on it since the beginning. My father had no knowledge of its existence and no legal access to it under any circumstances, including his role as executor of the main estate, because it was not part of the main estate. He reached into a folder and removed a single sheet. This is the instruction she left, he said, filed with me and with a separate copy in a sealed envelope with her personal effects. He read it aloud, and I will remember the exact wording for the rest of my life, because it is the most precisely Eleanor sentence she ever said about anyone. My son believes he controls my estate. He does not. That is why you exist. She knew, I said. She knew he was going to try to cut me out. She knew he had been intending to for some time, Mr. Connolly said. She described it to me as, Richard has always mistaken my patience for permission. He let that sit for a moment. There's something else, he said. I've had our accountant take a preliminary look at the main estate accounts, the ones your father does control, the ones he's been managing as executor. He slid a second sheet across the desk. I looked at the numbers without fully understanding them for a moment, and then I started to understand them. And then I felt something cold settle in my chest. The balance that should have been there, by any reasonable accounting of what Eleanor had accumulated over her life, was not there. Not entirely, not even mostly. Where did it go? I asked. He explained. The withdrawals, the shell company, the investment advisor who had twice been investigated for structures that fell just inside the legal definition of permissible and just outside the ethical one. The speed of it, months, not years, executed while she was dying and in the period immediately after. He hadn't been waiting for her to die to inherit. He'd been spending the inheritance while she was still alive. I sat in Arthur Connolly's office for a long time after that, not speaking, just looking at the numbers, at the dates, at the paper trail of it. She knew this too, didn't she? I finally said. She suspected, Mr. Connolly said carefully. She didn't have proof. But she was an intelligent woman who had watched her son make financial decisions for 50 years, and she made her plans accordingly. My father called me 3 weeks before my birthday and said they wanted to take me to dinner. His treat, he said, with the expansive confidence of a man who believed he was about to demonstrate financial health. Somewhere nice. We should celebrate properly. You don't turn 34 every year. I said that sounded great. I did not tell him that 2 days earlier I had had a second meeting with Arthur Connolly, in which we had discussed, in some detail, what would happen if my father attempted to transfer funds from the main estate to my sister without my knowledge or consent, and what the legal mechanism for preventing it looked like, and exactly how long it would take to execute. We had also discussed what would happen if he had already begun attempting to do this. It turned out there were forensic accountants who specialized in exactly this kind of situation, and that Mr. Connolly had one on retainer, and that the retainer was covered by the trust Eleanor had funded. She really had thought of everything. I spent the 3 weeks between that phone call and the dinner doing something I had never particularly done before in my life. Nothing. I went to work, I cooked dinner, I read. I let the machinery that Eleanor had set in motion a long time ago continue to operate without my interference. I did not confront my father. I did not warn my sister. I did not tell my mother. I did not revisit the numbers or call Arthur Connolly or do anything at all except wait. Waiting is underrated. People tend to conflate it with passivity, with not caring, with defeat. But there's a particular kind of waiting that is completely active, where everything you're doing is internally and you're just letting the external situation reach the moment it was always going to reach. Eleanor was masterful at it. She'd been waiting for 30 years for my father to become exactly who he was, and she'd been planning around it slowly, methodically, in amounts small enough not to trigger a conversation. I thought about this every day in those 3 weeks. I thought about how she'd never seemed angry about any of it. She'd seemed clear. There's a difference, and I spent a lot of time trying to understand it. By the time the dinner reservation came around, I was calm in a way that surprised me. They chose a restaurant called Saffron that I'd been to exactly once before for a work dinner. It was the kind of place that takes itself seriously, without quite having earned the right to good food, but with a slight atmosphere of performance, of everyone in the room being slightly aware they are having the kind of evening that gets described later. White tablecloths, candles that were decorative rather than illuminating, a wine list the size of a small novel. My father loved places like this. He ordered the wine the way he always did in places like this, quickly, confidently, with the air of someone who does this all the time, which is a performance that has always been more about the audience than the wine. I drove there alone. I'd considered what to wear for longer than I usually would, which surprised me until I understood what I was actually doing. I was dressing for a specific kind of moment, one that had been building for a long time, and I wanted to feel like myself when it arrived. I wore a blue dress I'd bought for a work presentation that I'd felt good in. I wore Eleanor's watch, which she'd left me separately outside the trust, with a note that just said, "For punctuality." I wore flat shoes because the parking garage had stairs I didn't trust in heels. I arrived exactly on time. My father hates when I arrive exactly on time because it makes it impossible to make a point of his own punctuality. He was already there, which meant he'd arrived early specifically to be seated before me, which meant he'd been planning this evening as a performance for at least as long as it had taken him to book the reservation. My mother was beside him, in a silk blouse she wore to things that mattered. Chloe was already there too, across the table, which I had not expected. Chloe's presence told me everything. She wouldn't have been at a birthday dinner unless she was there for the announcement. She'd been brought in for the announcement, or because she'd pushed to be there for it, or both. She was picking at the bread with the studied casualness of someone trying not to look like they're waiting for something. I sat down. I said hello to everyone. I accepted the menu and opened it and read it with the attention of someone who was not, in fact, able to process the text at all. My father ordered for the table immediately, not for each of us. He ordered appetizers for the table, which he does when he is in a certain mood. The mood of a man who is running the evening and wants everyone to understand that from the beginning. My mother didn't react. Chloe didn't react. I ordered my own entree when the waiter came back, partly because the one he'd have ordered for me was never what I wanted, and partly because it was the smallest possible declaration of independence available to me in that moment. We talked about nothing for a while. How was work? How were the kids? The weather had been unusual. Chloe's oldest had started soccer and showed early promise, and we heard about this for several minutes. My mother asked about my apartment. My father said something vague and positive about the economy that had no actual content. The bread came, my father ate a piece, then he folded his hands on the table. I had seen him fold his hands on the table in exactly this way perhaps a dozen times in my life, and it never meant anything good. It was a gesture he used when he'd made a decision and was now going to share it with you. The folding was preemptive. It communicated that the decision was already made and the sharing was a courtesy, not a consultation. "We've been doing a lot of thinking," he said, "since your grandmother passed, about the estate, about what she would have wanted for this family." My mother nodded. Chloe looked at the tablecloth. He explained it the way I'd expected, the language of fairness, of practicality, of hard choices made with the family's best interests at heart. Equity isn't always equality. Chloe has real needs: the children, the house, the financial pressure that comes with a young family, the circumstances that couldn't have been anticipated. And I had a good income, a stable situation, no dependents, a surplus every month. Surely I could understand that directing the resources to where they were genuinely needed was the only reasonable course of action. My mother nodded throughout. She nodded the way she'd been nodding since approximately 1985, with the exhausted sincerity of someone who has been agreeing to things for so long that disagreement is no longer in the available repertoire. My father looked at me when he finished. The look was practiced, a combination of apology and authority, of "I know this isn't what you wanted to hear, and this is how it is." The face of a man who has confused deciding with reasoning and long since stopped noticing the difference. Chloe was looking at the tablecloth. Not triumphant exactly, but she had the compressed expression of someone suppressing triumph, which is its own kind of tell. I picked up my water glass. I took a slow sip. I put it down. And I asked, "Does Grandma know you stole it?" The silence that followed had a very specific quality. Not the silence of confusion. Nobody at that table misunderstood the question. It was the silence of several people simultaneously recalibrating. My father's face went through a sequence of expressions very quickly. Surprise, then something like affront, then a brief flash of what I can only describe as awareness. The look of someone who suddenly understands that the ground they're standing on is different than they thought. And then he assembled something that was trying to be dismissiveness, but had too much effort in it to pass. What does that mean? He said. It means what it sounds like, I said. Your grandmother is gone, Jessica. He lowered his voice. This is disrespectful. This isn't the time or the place. I gave him the account number. Not loudly, not dramatically. I said it in a normal voice, the way you'd read an address out loud to someone entering it into a phone. I gave him the routing number and then the account number, and I watched his face as I said the digits, and I watched the color leave it. His hand, which had been reaching for his wine glass, stopped. He set it flat on the table. He pressed it down slightly, as if the table needed steadying. How do you? He started. She gave it to me, I said. 6 months before she died. She gave me the number and told me to keep it somewhere boring. My mother was looking at my father with an expression I couldn't entirely read. Not surprised, not quite, more like the look of someone who is watching a thing happen that they had always known was possible, but had agreed not to think about. Chloe had stopped performing casualness entirely. She was looking directly at me. You can't prove anything, my father said. His voice had lost its dinner party confidence. It was louder now, smaller. I reached into my bag. I took out my phone. I opened the email that Arthur Connolly had sent me, the one he had forwarded with a note that just said, when you need it. I put the phone on the table and turned it toward my father. It was an email from Eleanor. She had dictated it to Arthur the day before she died from the hospice room with the east-facing window and the early light. He'd read it back to her twice to confirm accuracy. She'd said, yes, that's exactly right. 3 sentences. Jessica receives the account in full. Thomas, she had used my father's middle name, the one he only used on legal documents, which was deliberate and which Mr. Connolly had confirmed was deliberate, receives nothing from this fund. This instruction is final and irrevocable. My father read it. I could see his eyes tracking the lines. I could see the exact moment he reached the 3rd sentence. He pushed back from the table. He didn't say anything. Not to my mother, not to Chloe, not to me. He put his napkin on the table and he stood up and he walked out of the restaurant in the manner of someone who has made a decision not to be present anymore and is executing it before they have time to reconsider. The 3 of us sat there. My mother was still holding her wine glass. She was looking at the place where my father had been sitting. Chloe was looking at the phone screen. She reached out slowly and turned the phone toward her. She read it. She read it again. Then she looked up at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before, not in 34 years of being her sister. Something had shifted in her face, some structure that had held a certain shape for a very long time. She looked younger somehow, and more frightened, and like she was trying to figure out whether to be angry at me or at someone else. I took the phone back. I put it in my bag. My mom, I said quietly. She turned her head. Her eyes were bright and a little unfocused, the way they get when she's in a situation she doesn't have a prepared response to. He's going to try to explain this, I said. He's going to call you tonight and explain it. He's going to say I had the numbers but not the context, that I misunderstood the situation. He's going to say there's a reason for all of it and it was all intended to be handled and the money is just temporarily allocated somewhere and there's no reason to panic. She looked at me without speaking. Don't agree to anything he says before you talk to a lawyer, I said. Your own lawyer, not his. I stood up. I put enough cash on the table to cover my portion of the bill because even now, in this, I didn't want to owe anyone anything. I'm sorry about your birthday, Chloe said, and she sounded like she actually was. I know, I said. I walked out into the night. The air was cold in that specific late spring way where cold is a surprise, where your body has decided it's done with cold and the weather hasn't caught up. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment outside the restaurant and looked up at a sky that was dark and clear and completely indifferent. Then I called Arthur Connolly. He answered on the second ring, as always. It happened, I said. How did he receive it? He said. He left, I said, without ordering. There was a brief pause. Then Mr. Connolly made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was in that general direction. Your grandmother, he said, predicted within approximately a 10-minute window that he would walk out of the restaurant. She said, he has never been able to manage a situation he can't control, and when he loses control, his only instinct is to remove himself from the room. She knew he'd walk out, I said. She spent 60 years watching that man, Mr. Connolly said. She knew most things about him. He told me the transfer would complete within the week. He told me the documentation was already filed and that my father, when he attempted to access the main estate accounts in the coming days, would find them frozen pending the investigation his actions had triggered. He told me the forensic accountant had completed the preliminary review and the findings were, in his careful language, significant. Significant, I said. He was quiet for a moment. Jessica, he said, there is a meaningful portion of your grandmother's liquid assets that are not where they should be. We will recover what we can, but you should know that the number we are working with in the separate account may end up being a substantial portion of what actually remains. I sat in my car in the parking garage for a long time after that call, not crying, not angry, just sitting with the particular weight of understanding a thing fully, not as an abstraction or a suspicion, but as a confirmed reality that you now have to organize your sense of your family around. He'd been stealing from his dying mother, not because he needed to exactly, not in any urgent survival sense, because he could, because he'd always operated in the belief that the money was already his, that her estate was his estate in waiting, and that accessing it early was just a matter of timing rather than ethics. Because for 50 years, he had been in a family where he was the center and the rules were arranged around him and the consequences were absorbed by other people, and he had never once, as far as I could determine, been made to stand entirely in the results of his own decisions. Eleanor had known this. She had watched it for decades, and in the last 3 years of her life, quietly, methodically, in amounts small enough not to trigger a conversation, she had built a structure that would outlast her, that would hold even after she was gone to hold it. That is why you exist. list, she had told Mr. Connolly, about the separate trust, and she had been right, and it did. I drove home. I fed my cat, whose name is not Bernard, but who has similar opinions about his food and sleeping arrangements. I made tea in my own kitchen, in a mug Eleanor had given me years ago. Plain white, heavy, the kind that holds heat, and I sat at my kitchen table and drank it. I thought about her in her kitchen with the yellow curtains that still worked fine. I thought about 40-minute drives and classical radio and the way she'd pat my knee and say nothing and mean everything. I thought about a folded piece of paper titled grocery list in my notes app, and 3 years of small transfers in amounts that didn't trigger a conversation, and a woman who had decided somewhere in her late 70s that the most useful thing she could do with the time she had left was make sure that the one person in her family who had never asked her for anything would be protected when she was no longer there to protect them. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, a car went by. Bernard, my cat, not hers, but I'd started thinking of him in her register, jumped onto the table and sat near my elbow in the specific way that communicates proximity without vulnerability. I thought about what she'd said in the car that Tuesday in October, looking through the windshield at her own front porch. I see more than they think I see. I always have. I know, I thought. I know you do. The tea went cold while I was sitting there. I noticed eventually and got up to make another cup. It was the best birthday dinner I never ate.